Well, good afternoon. I did start my journey this morning in Fargo, and I woke up and the electricity was off, so I wasn't sure how I was going to get the car out of the garage. But I figured out, you could do the normal thing, and then I was a little worried my wife wouldn't be able to get out later in the day if I didn't hook it up right, but I hope she's okay. And then the roads were a little bit icy coming down, and it reminded me that when I joined the Extension Service a few years ago, I had a mentor who'd actually served 30 years in the Extension Service, and he said that you just drive 70 miles an hour until you see the first car in the ditch, and then you slow down. And I wasn't sure that was really good advice, but that's more or less what I did. So I made it here. So my task today is to talk a little bit about spring wheat and barley production, and I don't know whether this will fit into your cropping systems or not, but anyway, you'll get a nice view of what we do in North Dakota and maybe give you some ideas. I'm going to start with the area. So this is the wheat, all of our classes. We grow durum, spring wheat, and winter wheat. So we actually have three classes of what's the pointer? This one. We have three classes of wheat, but this would be for all our classes of wheat. And you can see that this is area, the blue bar, and at one point we were like 12 million acres of wheat, and in the last few years we're down here about 8 million. So we're actually in a decline. I mean, you're interested in growing something different, and we're actually getting out of the business, so to speak. Part of that would be those great prices we've had for corn and soybeans, and so even though we're not an I state, we're growing a lot of corn and soybeans. And that's kind of been interesting because part of my educational program has been with corn. But if you look at the yield, we've actually seen a fairly substantial or consistent yield increase of about a bushel a year. Per acre, and if you think about that compared to your corn, you're not very excited, but that's just the nature of the beast we're dealing with. And also look at the yields. Typically we're talking in the state as a whole about 45 bushels, which again isn't very exciting, but we would be able to, in the best years, best locations, probably do 100 bushels of spring wheat. And this was just the yield trends for the different classes of wheat, and just to show you, this is durum, and durum is always going to be a lot lower yielding than our spring wheat. Spring wheat is typically lower than the winter wheat, and we've had a few years where, for whatever reason, the spring wheat's actually yielded better than the winter wheat. Do I think winter wheat might be a better fit for you down here? Depending on how you can plant in the fall, probably going to pick up a little yield advantage. And if you think of South Dakota, which is between us, we see a lot. They're about 50-50, I think, of winter wheat and spring wheat, and we're about 90 plus, maybe 95% spring wheat versus winter wheat. And I think and as you get into Kansas, what do they grow? They only grow winter wheat, and nobody grows spring wheat. So and there's obviously some reasons for that, and I'll maybe touch on a few of those reasons indirectly, but I think a lot of it has to do perhaps to the yield. And we grow a lot less winter wheat, maybe because, well, there's two things. One is that we have more risk of it not surviving the winter because of our winters. And the other thing is that we do have a substantial price premium for spring wheat most years. I mean, we can have $1 difference, we can have 50 cents difference pretty consistently. And that can be a significant motivation for us. All right, let me talk about some of the key production practices. I think the first one, when would you plant for spring wheat? And our recommendation, it's a cool season crop. The recommendation would be to plant as early as you can in the spring. And, some years you can't get out there till the 1st of May in North Dakota, but I think typically we like to have most of our crop done by the 1st of May. And so what would that mean for you in Iowa? I mean, I think you would want to go April 1, and somebody's birthday, right? 18th would be a great time to plant spring wheat, probably down in this neck of the woods. And part of the reason is because as you get, well, I'll tell you why. So here is just some data from one of our southern locations where this fellow, the researcher there, has just looked at the mean temperatures in July and how it correlated to yields, and it's pretty impressive, right? That, you know, when we have a warmer May-July period, our yields go down, and so it really is very sensitive to warmer temperatures, both during the early vegetative growth and during the grain filling. Both periods are quite sensitive to warmer temperatures. This is just some data that I put together for the last few years on planting dates, and so we're talking about early, kind of planting as soon as we can, and then late would be 3 weeks later. And you can see that, you know, in some environments we're seeing a 20 bushel yield reduction by that 3-week delay. And we had one example where actually we had better yield when we planted later. So we've had some really nice, cool summers these last couple of years, and that's where most of this data comes from. And you can see that maybe we don't have quite the penalty if we have a nice, cool summer like we've had these last couple. But so that would be kind of the first recommendation, is that you plant early. And part of that has to do with the development of the crop. So this is a very complex but nicely put together slide by a colleague in Argentina. And he just talks about, you know, where do these different yield components, when are they established? And if you think of this, this is your vegetative, about up to the 4 or 5 leaf stage. You know, you're putting on tillers. And during that stage, you also develop the size of the spike. And there's almost a direct correlation between, a negative correlation, right, between temperature and the size of the spike. And that's when you determine how many spikes. Now, you see tillers are producing during that same period, but they can also slough off as the season goes on. And so you see that there's a pretty long period on the number of spikes per plant being adding to the yield component of a small grain crop. This, I think, is a good example of the importance of this cool weather during the early season. As I mentioned, about by the 6th leaf stage, which happens pretty early in the season, is when the size of the spike is determined. And so everything after that is just how much you can fill the spikes and spikelets, etc. So this would be this number of spikelets per spike, and temperature, and optimum would be, you know, these temperatures 65 or below. So I think that, again, is going to make an argument for you to plant early, so you can position this early vegetative development during when the spike size is determined in a position where it's likely to be more favorable for large spike development. And I put this picture up there. It doesn't show it very well, but, you know, that would be the typical spike size. We might have 12 spikelets on a spike in North Dakota. And then this one, if you look at that, and, you know, it doesn't have all the typical barbs on it, but that one would have about 20 spikes. And I know Norman Borlaug is a son of Iowa, and he established a magnificent research facility in northern Mexico. And I worked for CIMMYT, where he was one of the organizations that he established. And in the summer, we did our research in the south, but in the highlands. And in the winter, we would go north. Had this research facility in the Sonoran Desert. It's an irrigated area, but it has this nice, cool environment. You know, you think Mexico would be a lot warmer than even here, but it's in the winter months and irrigated. And their typical spike size is like 20 spikelets per spike. And it's just, you know, perfect environment for this high yield development. So that is the challenge we have with that you're going to have to confront with as you consider small grains, is that these warmer temperatures that you're likely to have than what we have is going to affect the size of the spike that you can develop. So do we worry about frost early in the spring? You know, basically we're not that concerned about it, because the growing point is going to be below the surface of the soil, Most of the time, those early leaves tolerate quite a bit of cold weather, and so that's not a thing that we worry about, getting a frost before, early during that vegetative development. Now, we do probably, and if you look at North Dakota as a state, the corn and soybeans have moved up into the eastern part where we have more moisture, and so a lot of our small grains are still in the western part where we have less moisture. And moisture constrains production from most seasons. I mean, we had a couple of really good years, and I think that's why we've also seen a very high level of adoption of no-till. I mean, no-till, it kind of corresponds, where no-till is occurring corresponds to where moisture tends to be limiting. And so I would say that no-tilling is really a critical practice for us. It's in the drier regions. It conserves moisture, reduces labor, fuel savings. There are a lot of good things about no-till that you're aware of. And I think the main reason that we see the motivation for it would be the conservation of moisture. But it does allow us to do everything in a single pass. So some of the more experienced no-tillers would only go out one time. So all the fertilizer, the seed, everything goes down at the same time. And how do you do all that? Well, you can certainly have these mid-row banding types of situations where you can put your fertilizer in a mid-row band. We've got types of seeding, what would you call them? Instead of a disc. The openers that spread the seed and fertilizer and reduce the risk of damage and putting the seed and fertilizer together as well. So I would say that's a pretty common practice, and in a lot of ways makes sense. I know that we're all concerned about the efficient use of nitrogen, and so the question would be, is that really the best way to put all your nitrogen at the beginning? Should we be splitting it? And I'll talk a little bit about that, but very common in these drier areas of the state. Now these are some data. If you look at the yields, these are not very exciting yields. We're talking about 20 to 50 bushels, but looking at conventional till, continuous wheat, no-till following a pea crop, and you can see that we're picking up substantial yield advantage in both the rotation and the reduced tillage when we have these very dry seasons. And so this would be some technology that's helped these growers out in that drier part of the state. Will no-till be a preferable practice in Iowa? These are just some thoughts. I mean, I think the main issue, as I mentioned, is that of moisture in North Dakota. And tillage can reduce the issues associated with Fusarium head blight, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And especially you have so much corn in your systems here. Corn is a nice, it harbors a lot of the inoculum for Fusarium head blight. And so, getting rid of that residue is beneficial for that particular disease. And I think the other thing is that if you're going to plant early like I've suggested, how are you going to do that if your soils are wet in the spring? And sometimes the tillage in the fall or other things will help warm the soil up and dry it out. And that's kind of what we see in what we call the Red River Valley of North Dakota. A lot of tillage there, fall tillage, because they want to be able to get in the spring as soon as they can. And by doing that tillage, it dries the soil out and helps them to do that. So that may be one of the challenges that, when I think of Iowa, I think you have a lot of residue, you have a lot of moisture. Do you have any snow down here? Sometimes you have snow that melts, and, if you want to get out there early, you've got wet soils, and so being able to get in the field can be a critical issue in growing a small grain. What about seeding rates? So this is some data from 2013. There are actually 12 different varieties a graduate student of mine put together. And, you can see that, we continue to get some kind of a response up to about 2 million seeds per acre. There's just some other data. This is a couple of different years looking at different planting dates. So this would be if you look at this early plant in 2013, we probably peak out at about 1.5 million seeds per acre. We planted a little bit later. Maybe we were talking about 1.7 million as being an optimum. And we see maybe some of that same trend in 2015 as well. So, and if I was looking at that, I'm just showing you data, what seeding rate would you pick? And it's kind of hard to know if, adding that extra half a bushel or whatever is going to be profitable for you. And the answer is probably not. And remember also, as you crank up the seeding rate, you are increase the potential for some lodging. So, roughly I would say a safe seeding rate, at least for our situation, about 1.4 million. Later planting may be slightly higher, up to maybe 1.6. And again, lodging can be a significant issue that's exacerbated by higher seeding rates, and it kind of depends on the kinds of varieties that you're going to grow. And maybe because you're further south, being on the higher end of planting rate might be more logical than being on the lower end of that range. Talk about fertilizer use. I'm not going to talk about the other than nitrogen. I think that those other nutrients would be based on soil test related recommendations, but nitrogen is going to be the most commonly. And in the past, we've used this rate of 2 point, and my soil fertility colleague, extension colleague would say we don't do this anymore, but this is nice rule of thumb, about 2.5 pounds per bushel of expected yield, reducing rotation credit. So if you're following soybeans, you get 40 pounds, and whatever you've got as a nitrate in the fall before. So that's a pretty high rate. If you're talking about 100 bushel crop, you're talking about probably as much as you're going to be putting in your corn. And part of the reason is because we're trying to get the protein quality, and I'll talk a bit about that. This is the relationship between protein and yield, and this is the delicate balancing act that the growers have to deal with, because our desired, or kind of the market level protein for spring wheat is 14%. And so you can get a substantial discount if you go to the market and you have less than that, and you might get a pretty good bump in premium if you've got more than that. But look at these are just varieties. These are the grain yield, the percent of the mean of the experiments that we put these in. So anything above 100% would be those higher yielding varieties, and what are they? These are all lower in protein. And so this becomes one of those challenges, right? So what variety do you grow? You probably, one of the things we're recommending, I'm recommending more and more, is these kind of middle types that have a balance between protein and yield. I think some of the millers, they like these ones over here, right? High protein, but you have to give up some yield to get that high protein. And this is why, is because this is the relationship between protein and loaf volume, and a lot of this spring wheat is used for bread or raised dough type of products. So crackers and cookies, you don't use spring wheat because it makes a lousy cookie or cracker. But if you want a raised dough product, you've got to have that gluten that everybody's afraid to eat these days, right? I love gluten, so bring it on. And so I think our data would suggest that in most cases it's probably more efficient and effective to put all of the nitrogen on at or before planting. And if you think about your corn scenario, you're doing more splits down here, because think about the length of the growing season of the corn versus wheat. And also remember that we really don't see our yield is established by that 4 or 5 leaf stage, so you don't have a very big window to put that second application on as far as yield is concerned. Some of those later applications will have a beneficial effect on protein, but not necessarily on yield. And so our recommendation, if you are going to split, about by the 5-leaf stage for yield. And, in that case, they use these streamer bars. I don't know, in corn, we don't use streamer bars, but they're kind of nice things. You actually can get some nozzles that you put on your herbicide and fungicide spraying apparatus that will do something similar, but the UAN coming out in those streams is going to do a lot less damage on the leaves, and actually it kind of bounces off the leaves and most of it falls on the ground. So it's kind of a nice system for that split application. And this is just some data to show you the difference between, the blue would say all the fertilizer at planting, and then this would be a split with that 5 or 6 leaf stage, and then this third split would be a late season application, foliar application. And I think if you look at those data, you'd say, maybe we got a little advantage that year, maybe a little there. Nothing, it was actually negative there, pretty much the same. And so it kind of depends on the kind of season we have, but really pretty hard to justify a split most seasons. And I threw this in. I'm not, that one of the things that we have seen some increase in popularity is this post-anthesis application of UAN, and it's about 30 pounds of nitrogen. It's mixed with water, 50-50, and it will increase the protein. It won't do anything for yield. In fact, it may even ding the yield a little bit if you burn the leaves too much, but this will give you about a half to a full % protein on the varieties. And so some of the growers are growing these higher yielding, lower protein varieties and augmenting the protein with this late season application. All right, disease is a big issue with small grains. I work with corn as well, and I really have to look hard to find a disease of corn in North Dakota. I mean, we don't have any foliar diseases. I mean, we have this normal stalk rots and some of the smuts and things in the ears, but foliar diseases are, you just don't find them, and that's not the case with wheat. And we've got way we control the diseases would be the first level of defense would be genetic resistance. I think we've got good rust resistance for most of the rust most of the time. We've got intermediate tan spot resistance, moderate scab or fusarium head blight resistance. Second would be crop rotation, and we certainly avoid wheat after wheat or wheat after corn. And then finally would be fungicides. And so leaf rust would be a big one. It's one of those diseases that blows up from the south. I think the same kind of scenario you heard about for oats. Septorian tan spot, they tend to overwinter on the residue of the small grain. So if you're not growing wheat after wheat, you tend to have less disease pressure for these types of diseases. And then fusarium head blight would be one that's going to likely be problematic for you because that's caused by fusarium, and it's a natural kind of pathogen. It's a saprophytic pathogen that you're going to have on your corn. So you have a lot of corn around. In fact, so we really didn't have a problem with this until the early 90s. We had kind of a wet cycle, but everybody also said, well, that's the time we started moving corn into North Dakota, and so corn is the cause of it. Well, I don't think corn was the cause of it necessarily because there's plenty of spores around. It's just you need the conditions to be favorable. But yeah, you'll have plenty of fusarium spores in Iowa. So this is just showing you where our diseases that develop. The red would mean a high incident. And if you look at, this is for tan spot, and if you say, well, why is that such a big deal out there in the southwestern part of the state where it's the driest? And that's basically because they grow wheat on wheat. So we get that kind of disease because of continuous wheat. We have forecasting models that kind of help us determine whether a fungicide application would be useful in controlling these diseases. And I think that you as growers can also say, if I've got a lot of moisture, a lot of rainfall, it's probably a good indication that you're going to have some disease development. And this is just some data to show you. So this is an early application. So one popular application is mix of fungicide with the herbicide at that 4 or 5 leaf stage when most of the herbicide applications go on. It's cheap. It's a couple of dollars an acre, and if you can get the application cost at no cost, most growers say, I'm just going to put it in. But, if you look at these data, Well, you know, this would be that early application of a fungicide with the herbicide. You can see in 1 year we picked up a few bushels, would have probably made that profitable, but generally it's pretty hard to find consistent yield advantage. But again, most growers say, you know, at $2 it's probably worth the risk. But typically, you know, I'm thinking in your scenario, if you're not growing wheat after wheat, you're probably not going to have a lot of disease unless you've got some rust in that blew up early from Texas. The other application timing would be, the one that we do a lot of would be at what we call Feeks 10.51, which is right at flowering. And the reason we put that on would be primarily for control of scab or fusarium head blight. And I think that, you know, I always, like I say, you're probably going to be in a situation where that could be an issue for you. The nice thing about it is it also will do a pretty good job of protecting your flag leaf. So if you've got rust and other things that are coming in late, that application will protect your flag leaf and protect some yield. And so this is some some data showing that yield increases with a fungicide application at that later date. And you can see in some of these scenarios we're getting some really substantial yield increases. I think we see greater yield increase with this winter wheat than we see with the spring wheat. We've got a better disease package, genetic disease package, I think, that helps us in that regard. And then, as I mentioned, one of our first levels of defense against disease would be genetic resistance, and so we do have some varieties of spring wheat that are more resistant to scab. You can see this group here. We don't have any 1s up there. We don't have even any 2s up there, but we've got some 3s and 4s that provide us some level of resistance. And I would think those would be kind of things you'd look at. You know, that's what your grain looks like if you've got a lot of disease development, and the millers just love that, don't they? So the level of DON that is acceptable in food industry is 2 parts per million. Sorry, it's 1 part per million. Typically at the elevator they'll buy it if it's 2 parts per million because they can, when they mill it, they can get rid of 1 part per million. But you know, anything above 2 parts per million, you either can't sell it or you get some pretty substantial discounts at the elevator. But that one there would probably be a 15 parts per million, so don't, hopefully that's not very common. So our recommendations for disease control is, you know, apply a fungicide based on predicted need, not just a routine kind of thing. Use genetic resistance as part of an integrated package. I think that's always really helpful. Ergot. Let's see, is ergot an oat problem? Rye, I think you see it in rye, is really common, but we can get it in barley and wheat, and in the last few years we've seen quite a bit of it, and I think it has to do with very wet, nice conditions during that flowering process that can predispose the crop to ergot. And again, I think depends on how often you have a small grains in the system and how much, you know, you can have ergot that's in the grassy ways around it, and so it seems like you can get it when you think you shouldn't ever have to find it. But and again, you'd think that you wouldn't get discounted heavily because it would seem like it'd be easy to get that out. I don't know how easy it is to get ergot out of oats or out of barley and wheat. Yeah, and but nevertheless, you can, if you had a seed lot like that, you would have one heck of a discount at the elevator. You'd probably get turned away. But you can see, these are sample areas, you know, and we're seeing 3 or 4 or 5 different fields that were sampled that had ergot of any substance. Stem maggot and sawfly. I don't think you're going to have a sawfly issue down here. It tends to be in that really pocket of the dry part of the state. Montana has more sawfly. Bacterial leaf streak, I think this would be potentially an issue. It's, you know, it's a kind of pathogen that's pretty generic. You get lots of windy, rainy days that you can end up with some wheat streak, and unfortunately, you can't control it with a fungicide, so you're kind of just stuck with it unless you've got some genetic resistance. And we're starting to see that we do have some differences amongst our genotypes that give us some help with that, with regard to bacterial leaf streak. Talk about variety selection. Our recommendation, of course, you use multiple location data to select a variety, and that's going to be hard in Iowa. I don't know when the last variety trial was done of spring wheat in Iowa, but that's the kind of the recommendation is use what you have the good data to support it. In North Dakota, we have about 7 or more plus locations where we test everything. Fortunately, the small grains aren't quite like corn and soybeans where you have hundreds to choose from and lots of turnover, rapid turnover. So I think you have a chance to kind of get a feel for what works and make a selection. And unfortunately, with the case of spring wheat, you're going to have to consider protein or quality issues, as well as disease resistance, not just yield. And this is a table. I just show you what we put together for our farmers. This would just be a table 1 that gives an idea of the different characteristics, height, straw strength, maturity, how they, the kind of disease resistance they have. This would be a table we put together on the milling and baking quality. I don't think the farmers really like this, but the producers do, and it's kind of it gives some idea to the growers that what the millers are going to be giving some preference to. So you can see some are actually really good for milling and baking. Some are not so exciting. And then finally, this would be a table of yields. And so, as I mentioned, we have 7 locations, and we divide up the state between east and west. And we've got individual locations and 3-year averages. So basically, that would give enough information for farmers to make selections. And this is just to show you the kind of variability we might have for protein. As I mentioned, we want to, you're going to want to produce up to about 14% as a minimum for protein. And you can see that we have varieties that do really well for protein and some that don't do as well. And that might be something that you would consider. I mean, it would kind of depend on your market, right? So if you're growing spring wheat and you want that premium that's associated with spring wheat, which is associated with the higher protein, these are some of the factors I think you're going to have to look at. And then this was just a simple exercise because at the elevator you get a whole range of discounts and premiums on the protein. And so, we talked about varieties having different protein levels and different yield potential levels. And so, if wheat's $5 and protein's $1 versus $5 versus 50 cents, then the variety you're going to select is going to be somewhat different. You look at a Fowler is a high yielding variety. Well, that's going to be below average for income on these 2 scenarios, but where protein premium is pretty low because of its higher yield capacity, it's going to be your best variety in a year where protein premiums are low. So you didn't show anything in yours with proteins, did you? But I think this year it's been about 25 cents a point for protein in North Dakota. And last year we probably saw some $1.25 up to $1.25 per point in protein. So big swings makes a huge difference when you market it in some years and not others. And it'd be great if you could predict what kind of year it's going to be. And then you would choose your varieties accordingly. So what are some other, these are kind of cleanup topics. So what are other recommendations? Best rotations. Wheat following soybeans, I think, would be certainly preferred over wheat following corn, and mainly because of that issue of fusarium head blight. Weed control, we got a wide range of herbicides. Most are applied at that 4 to 5 leaf stage. We do have some populations of wild oats that have resistance to some of our grass herbicides, but for the most part, I think we have enough to choose from at the moment that we can do a pretty good job of weed control in wheat. Harvesting spring wheat, the maximum storage moisture of 14% for less than 9 months, 13% for more than 9 months. We do a lot of natural air drying, and I think it would work fine if you've got, some air on a bin. when you harvest and you come in a little wet with the temperatures that you're likely going to be at. You know, sometimes with some of our crops, we get really cold by the time we get it in the bin, like our corn. You know, natural air drying of corn just doesn't work in North Dakota because you can't dry anything with the kind of cold weather we have up there. But with wheat, I think you'd be able to do a good job of drying your small grains down with the natural air. So I think that covers spring wheat. Any questions? And then I'll move into barley. I'm a little slow. All right, take them at the end. So the other topic I was to talk about spring barley, and what I want to talk about primarily is barley for malt, because that I think is your biggest potential market where you can make some money on. I mean, the difference between malt and seed or feed barley is, you know, can be a couple of dollars a bushel. And of course, I guess there's a food market for barley too. And that one I don't know much about, but that is probably a growing market for barley. But as I said, our growers are mainly concerned about barley for malt because of the premium, and the only reason we have barley for feed is because it doesn't make it to malt. I mean, I'm overgeneralizing, but that's basically everybody sets out to grow it for malt, and if they don't make it, then it goes to the feed market. Now there's a lot of interest, you've probably heard about it, you know, is locally produced barley for local malt houses that are local brewers. I don't know in Ames if you've got a lot of local brewers, but you probably do. It seems to be a growing area, and so we get a lot of questions, if you can imagine, of growing barley in Massachusetts. And they want to take our North Dakota varieties and grow them in Massachusetts because they've got all these malt houses out there, little malt houses that want to have locally produced stuff. So it could be a potential niche market for some of you, and so I'm going to talk about the barley. But look at the trends of barley production in North Dakota. You know, it's not very exciting. If you thought people were getting out of spring wheat, they really got out of barley. So it's becoming almost a minor crop, less than 100,000 acres in the last couple of years. And we primarily have been growing 6-row barleys. That's what the you know, out in the west, they grow a lot more of the 2 rows, but we've been doing the 6-row barleys, and I think we've seen some switch from 6 rows to 2 rows. 2 rows actually produce more malt, and so these craft brewers, they actually prefer the 2-row to the 6-row, and that seems to be the bigger market right now. So what are some of the requirements for making malt? You've got to have very good germination. If it doesn't germinate, it doesn't make malt, and so that's one of the criterion is good germination. You've got to have a moderate level of protein. Unlike spring wheat I talked about, we needed 14%. That's really quite low relative to that, 11 to 13%. You want low foreign material, good low moisture. Plump kernels are important because the malt is the yield of malt is dependent on how fat that kernel is. No broken kernels, no skin kernels. So yeah, if you think you have, I mean, you have it easy when you market corn. You just, you know, there's not that many things you get discounted for. But when you take spring wheat, we get discounted because of dawn and because of protein. And now barley, you look at all the things you have to meet. And that's why you can see probably that people are getting out of growing it because it's hard to meet all of these criteria. And so our main challenges in making malt in the eastern part would be these dawn levels, or the vomitoxin that I talked about that's associated with fusarium head blight. In the western part of the state, where it's drier, we have problems with elevated protein and the lack of plumps. Okay, so you get a stress plant, it's going to have high protein and it's going to have a skinny kernel. So our main, package of recommendations would be the variety, planting date, seeding rate, some of those same things that I've talked about. This would be, there is a list of what's called approved malting barley varieties. And this, if you just Google AMBA is the group that puts these together on behalf of the different malting organizations. You can see that there's a pretty long list there. Probably about half of those are varieties that we might grow in North Dakota. And these are all spring varieties. There are some winter varieties, I grew one winter variety one year, and there was absolutely not a single plant that survived in North Dakota. So, you know, we're not even messing with winter types, but it could be that, you know, there are some winter types that may be adapted to Iowa that might be something you want to consider too. Okay, since in most cases malt production is through an identity preserve program, so a lot of times our growers actually have a contract before they grow. And in those contracts it specifies, we want you to grow this variety. You have to grow it with certified seed, and it comes back, and you still have to battle with those requirements of making the malt. But I think probably in Iowa you'd have a little more flexibility, but it could be that you have to actually enter into an agreement before you grow it as to the type of variety you're going to grow. But if you have flexibility in selecting a variety, you're going to want to consider protein, standability, because lodging is a big issue for varieties of barley, and disease resistance. This is just show you some of the trends in our varietal use in North Dakota. We stopped getting data on this after 2013, but you can see that we tend to have very large concentrated use of one variety, and that's because the maltsters, they like uniformity, and they tend to pick one that they like that fits into their brewing process or whatever. And that's why, you know, Tradition, I think, is a Bush Ag release variety, and that it probably still more or less that same amount of the area. And this is just showing this from some of our variety trials, the differences in yield, and you'd look across there and say, well, you know, we have some that are a little lower yielding, but for the most part, not a big difference. It tends to be more what the maltsters are wanting that dictates what kind of varieties are growing. And then these two over here, Pinnacle and Genesis, these are two-row varieties. And you can see that at least in the last couple of years that they've had some real good yield advantage. Or they performed as well or better than our six-row types. And these are the proteins. I mentioned that high protein is a problematic. And if you grow a barley under stress, you're going to have high proteins. And we do have a couple of these varieties. These are both those two-row I talked about that have a gene for low proteins. And these are varieties that consistently are in that lower protein area. So that might be something that you might consider as you move into a scenario where you might be having stress on your crop. And then again, planting early for barley, same story that I gave you for spring wheat, and this is showing you the yield decline as we plant later. This was up at Minot, which is the central northern part. This is in Langdon, right up there by Canada. Same scenario there. A little bit later planting date is optimum because you can't get in earlier than that. And you can see the effect on protein. We don't want high protein. Earlier planting results in not only higher yield but lower protein. That's good news. And for plumps, you know, we see a range there, but the later you get stress, then you do have problems in meeting the plumps. And then let's talk about the seeding rate. I think it's the same scenario I more or less talked with you about for the spring wheat. If you look across there, somewhere between 1 to 1.5 million would be an optimum. And this is for robust, which is an older variety that tended to lodge more. But again, I think it's pretty indicative of the type of response to planting density. These are some data from 2015 on the new two-row barley, ND Genesis. And you know, I wondered if I was a grower and looked at these data, what would be the plant population that I would grow? And that, I mislabeled that last one. I think that's 2 million instead of 1751. But you see at Langdon, that's that high yield environment. It looked like it just kept going up and up. He did an economic analysis and said that your most economic plant population would be 2 million. But if you look at the others, you know, there's a lot of noise. And it kind of suggests to me that if you can get at least that 750 to 1 million, 750,000 to 1 million, that's probably going to be adequate in most years, particularly if you can get it planted early. Lodging, remember lodging, too many seeds, higher potential for lodging. And we still have that same problem of Fusarium head blight that we had in spring wheat. It doesn't affect yield as much in barley as it does in wheat because it attacks the barley at a later stage. So your kernel's already fairly well developed because actually the barley flowers, fertilizes before it emerges from the boot, but you still have it developing on the outside and causing this dawn that is a disaster. So apparently it causes gushing in beer. So it means that, you know, if they brew it and there's a lot of dawn, when you take the cap off, 90% of your beer ends up on the table when you've taken the cap off, I guess. So brewers don't like any dawn. And I think the message here would be you still have that fungicide regime that I talked about, but it's going to be an earlier application than we have with spring wheat. Okay, so how do we manage protein? You want to plant early, because remember in this case we want less protein, we want to fertilize early, don't split, choose varieties that have low protein, and probably this 1.5 times your yield goal would be more accurate than, remember in spring wheat we talked about 2.5. So this barley on the fertilizer side is definitely a lower input than our spring wheat. And this is just showing you the amount of fertilizer applied, different years, and protein. You know, basically these are okay in these moderate to wet years at about 80 pounds per acre. In this dry year, even at your zero level of nitrogen, you're too high in protein. So, you know, if you're out west, you really have to be careful about your protein. So in conclusion, for barley, you know, making malt requires good management and cooperative weather. Newer varieties offer some yield potential over the older ones. There's a growing interest in two-row barley. Sorry about the misspelling there. And certainly planting early for yield and lower protein. Seed about 1.25 million. And, you know, try to manage the risk of scab or Fusarium head blight by planting date and using fungicides appropriately. So I think with that, I think I have time for questions. Okay, so the question would be, how about fertilizing winter wheat compared to spring wheat? I talked about kind of a spring application at planting or before planting being probably about as efficient as we're going to get. What about winter wheat? Well, winter wheat becomes a little more complicated, right, because you're planting it in the fall. So you have this dilemma, do I put some of the fertilizer down the fall or do I put it all in the fall? Or do I come in the spring? And I think our recommendation would be probably a single application and probably in the spring. But again, you have to make sure, because you're, in the case of winter wheat, you're going to be putting it on the surface. So let's say you put a urea application out. You're going to broadcast that on the surface, and you're going to cross your fingers and hope for a rain event to get it in. Whereas with the spring wheat, you know, we can actually incorporate it, and we're not so worried about the volatilization. But generally, you know, I'd say most growers probably put it on in the spring rather than with the seed in the fall. But, you know, if you're no-tilling and you have it all set up for a single pass, you're tempted to put it on in the fall. Okay, so the question would be, how about, can we reduce winter hardiness by putting too much nitrogen in the fall at planting? And you know, there are some data that would suggest that could be an issue, but for us up there, our growth is so minimal in the fall. You know, if we get planted 15th September, 1st of October, we don't get a lot of growth, and I don't think we see much of a problem. I think the phosphorus becomes more of an issue, and I think you folks, you know, if you're growing corn, you probably have enough phosphorus in the soil that probably isn't an issue, but if your plant is suffering from a deficiency of phosphorus in the fall, I think there's some data to say that would be more problematic for winter hardiness than the nitrogen issue. Yes, sir. Yeah, so they run it over a sieve. So the question was about what about plumps? What does that mean? Is it a screen size? And I don't remember the screen size, but there's a specific size that they screen it out. Do you remember what it might be for? Yeah. And it really gets back to malting. You know, if you're going to use it as a food grade, you pearl it or you grind it, you know, all those. So you may be less critical, but for malting, you want that big fat thing because the malt comes about as you germinate it and what's left after you've germinated it. Okay, so the question is about vomitoxin. Are you going to be in a high-risk scenario? And I think you are, right? Because you've got plenty of inoculum because you've got corn already. And you tend to be wetter than we are in North Dakota for the most part. And it really depends on kind of that period from the beginning of flowering through about, a third of the way into grain fill. That's a sensitive time. And if you have dry weather, low humidity, you're not going to have vomitoxin or dawn problem. But you know, at least in the eastern part, I don't know where your dry part of the state is. Northwest. I mean, those drier areas, you're going to have less possibility of risk. But it's not going to be a problem every year. And how do you test it? So the buyers are very keen on this, right? So the buyers, so the elevators, like our elevators, if they know that there's likely some problem with fusarium in the area, they'll run they'll test every lot coming in. And they use a quick strip test, I think, for the most part, because they're not set up to do the expensive GLC. But that's how they do it. They'll just do a quick strip test, and it gets pretty accurate and it's pretty quick. But it's a little scary, yeah. Yes, ma'am. I believe that is the case, yes, because the 2-row barley is always going to be a lot plumper than the 6-row. And I think that, like the Bush Ag used to like 6-row. They had a certain, so the Budweiser had a certain percentage of that. You had a 6-row, and pardon, Harrington and Stander and Morex and some of these old timers. And I think nowadays they're putting more what do they call them? Added adjunts, which means corn and sorghum or whatever else will ferment, and so they're reducing the amount of malt, and I think that's why you see barley acreage reducing a little bit. But yes, the kernel size, I think, is the main reason you get more malt out of a 2-row than you would out of a 6-row. And I think that's a possibility. So don't fertilize, right? You just grow the thing and cross your fingers that you have high yields and low protein. Yeah, so, you think of an integrated program, you're going to try to get the most disease-resistant variety, and you're going to want to position it where you have the least inoculum available. That doesn't mean that if you plant wheat after soybeans, there won't be any inoculum because there's plenty of it around, but it reduces the amount of inoculum. It gives you a little better head start. So, yeah, it's really one of those key components of an integrated program. I was fast. Oh. Okay, so the question is, have the standards changed in the last 40 years? Is it more difficult to meet the standards than it was 40 years ago? I think that probably the industry's able to be stricter on standards than they were 40 years ago. We're more sophisticated. They can do a lot of testing at the time of that you drop off your lot of seed, so that's part of it. And so, yeah, I suspect, they're trying to make an extra buck, and they make an extra buck by making more malt, and they make more malt by having more uniform and higher quality seed. And so I think that they're just demanding higher, they probably have a higher standard in that regard. Okay, so the question is, to what extent do they save seed? Now, I talked about malting being somewhat of an identity preserved, and in those cases, you have to, if you have a contract with Bush Ag, they're going to say you have to grow certified seed, and so in those cases, you're buying certified seed. But for most of the small grains, I would say about once in 3 years they purchase certified seed. We see a trend, we got some new companies in the business that are requiring seed being purchased every year. They're not allowing farmers to save seed, but generally, and I would say in general, in our main areas of wheat producing areas, they're saving their own seed, and that's for spring wheat. If you think of Durham, they only buy certified seed once in 6 years, so a lot of saved seed.
All right, let's thank Joel for coming down and talking to us. Thanks, Joel.